Welcome to the Minus One podcast, where we talk to the most interesting people in the world about times in their lives when they've had to figure out how and why to go from -1 to 0, and to figure out one of the hardest questions there is, which is what's next. And I am particularly excited today because our guest is a close friend of South Park Commons, and she joined as a member back in our earliest days, I think in 2015 and 2016. I wanted to introduce you to Kanjun Qiu, who is now the CEO and co-founder of Imbue. And she's working on building foundation models for AI agents that can reason and accomplish goals in the real world. Kanjun is a serial entrepreneur, having started an AI recruiting company, a VR hardware company. She also has a venture fund, Outset Capital. So she's done a lot. You're working on agents at Imbue. So let me try to ask you a slightly adjacent question to agents to kind of kick us off. When I see your background, I see that you have very high agency across all of your domains. Ha! Yes, I did it. You've started you started a co-living space, a hardware company, an AI company, a recruiting company. So what drives you? What gives you kind of like the energy and kind of like this spring of like this well of ambition that kind of drives you?
That's a great question. I think it took me a long time to figure that out because I was raised by Asian parents who are like, it's really important to make money and have a stable job. And I didn't find that very exciting. And so I started just doing stuff, and it took me a long time to figure out the theme. I think the theme for me, I'm really obsessed with human potential. And sounds kind of trite when I say it that way, but I think if you talk to like, why did we start a co-living house? I really have this sense that there's a lot of latent potential in people. And there's this concept from Kevin Kelly, I think, called scenius. So if genius is in your genes, scenius is in your scene. And this idea that you can actually get a lot of kind of collective intelligence that is able to move beyond what a single person could move beyond. That was the co-living house. When I was very young, I like loved management sims. These are like video games like Roller Coaster Tycoon.
Yes.
My parents were not into this, but I think I just like really kind of enjoy unlocking the potential of like a people, of a system. Yeah. And
I mean, wow, it's like you have managed to engineer that across, like bits and atoms and humans, kind of like if you think about it. So,
they're also very
obviously
similar.
they're all very similar. And, I think way more convergent as we are finding, kind of like as, we kind of go down this grand experiment of AI. I actually think that, I mean, you know what? Let's just explore this, right? Like one of the things that I find fascinating is that I think that AI is actually teaching us a lot about what it means to be human. And kind of like, as opposed to, we keep on trying to think about these like AI like systems as kind of being this artificial intelligences. But I actually think it's teaching us what it is to be human, what like it's challenging our notions of what intelligence is. Curious if you feel the same way.
Oh yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in like at least two domains. So the first domain is like, what has AI taught us about human intelligence? And I kind of have this notion that trauma, what we call trauma, is model overfitting. We've overfit to an old data distribution. So, and now our world is different. Like trauma is kind of like a response we store because we had some fear or we've adopted a belief from a parent. So this is like in our childhood data distribution. And now we grew up, we have new strategies, new tools, but we're still using those very old overfit strategies. And so therapy is actually a retraining process. I have like a half-written essay on this, but haven't finished it yet.
I mean, you could argue that like CBT is actually like almost by definition collecting a bunch more like fine-tuning samples to like retrain your model.
I actually think, the retraining has 3 steps. There's like accessing the old models, there's like getting new training data, and there's updating. One of the issues with a thing like CBT is really good at getting new data. It's like asking you about like, what's the cost of your current belief, but it's not good at accessing. Then there are other therapy techniques like internal family systems, really good at accessing and like finding that data, but not good at getting new data. So actually combining, I've gotten a lot of luck out of combining these different modalities to like both access and get training data and update.
I mean, this is a
So
really good
that's
point. I mean, personally, I've done a lot more of the more classic personal therapy myself, right? Kind of like talk-based therapy and so on. And I think that you're right. It's actually really good at almost like introspecting on your model. And in some ways, like being able to understand like what data did I feed into my model that is kind of making me, essentially like have the output that I give right now. But it's not that good at like, okay, but I want to give it new data now, right? Like I want to like
exactly. I want to now
rewire that.
update the model. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I bet we could spend the whole kind of like show on this, but I'm gonna come back to something you said earlier. By the way, your analogy about seniors, I would say that that is a key insight about South Park Commons as well, and
Yeah.
in particular about entrepreneurship. I think one of the mythologies that I want to bust in Silicon Valley. I think the classic mythology is almost like a hero/heroine founder who kind of had a stroke of genius at the top of the mountain. They kind of build something, they bring it down, they release it to the world, right? And I just don't think that's true. I think most great work is done by talented people in kind of like these settings which are somewhat competitive and collaborative, right? And I think this applies to founders, it applies to academics, it applies to elite sports teams, like basically this group of really highly talented people in a seniors-like setting, right? Um, but coming back to it, I think your point about unlocking human potential at scale, do you think that agency and ambition is something that can be taught? Like, can people be taught to have more agency and be more ambitious? Or do you think that the baseline is already pretty set by, either kind of like hereditary factors, genetic factors, or kind of like somebody's like childhood? Curious if how much delta do you think we can unlock as people trying to design systems for other humans or founders?
Yeah, I think agency is definitely taught. At least for
Okay.
me, I
Okay.
feel
Cool.
like every high agency person, maybe it's not taught, but it's again, it's like a model update learning.
Yep.
So I think every high agency person I've talked to has had some key experiences that gave them this sense of agency. For me, I was playing this text-based mud when I was 12, and I started this clan. It was like a 50-person clan, and was running this clan, and it became the top clan in the mud. But then I like at some point was having conversations with my co-founder and some other people in our clan, and I was like, "Oh yeah, like how old are you guys?" And they were like, "Oh, I'm 49." And one person's like, "Oh, I'm 35." And I was like, "Wow, I cannot tell them that I'm 13." Cool. And I think it's like a really big agency defining experience. So I think definitely like agency is about belief, like a realization that the world is malleable and that
Yeah.
like molding it is within your action space.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely teachable.
That's so true. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, now that I map it back to my own experiences, I think one of the big aha moments as a software engineer comes when you realize that you don't have to work on a pre-existing project or like some structure that like you might be given either as a work assignment or a school assignment, but when you can literally start from a blank like file and fill in the code from scratch, right? And
Yes.
in some ways when you have this moment that you can create something from nothing, right? Because that is kind of like this very big aha moment that you can shape the world from
Yes.
scratch according to what you want. And I
Yeah.
find that not enough people force themselves to do that, right? Like, and I think one of my hopes with LLMs in particular is that they allow us to do, they're very good with blank slate creativity, right? You're faced with a blank slate, it will allow you to get going creatively by like jamming with you, kind of like, and so on. So I'm hoping that more people can get that aha moment.
Yeah, this is actually the mission of Imbue. Imbue
Okay.
is about agency, but in the digital world, we really believe basically that we can unlock the power of computing much more for people and also help people like have that aha moment so they can create in their digital environment. Like right now, our digital environments are very centralized. They're very disempowering
Absolutely.
actually for
Yeah.
most people. It's so expensive to like build any piece of software. It's
Yep.
kind of like manufacturing a long time ago. You like couldn't buy things off Amazon, so it's like really
Yep.
hard to modify your personal environment.
Yep.
And I think in the future, our experience with our digital environment could be so different. Like right now, because it's so centralized, it feels quite extractive.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have
It's
these like
really
really
interesting.
sweet.
I mean, yeah, to pull on that thread for a second, right? I mean, I think that if you look at the early days of the internet, one of the reasons why it felt like so creative and expressive was because like everybody, in some ways, a lot more people were essentially like, they kind of felt
Creators.
comfortable writing like, yeah, they were creators. They would write some HTML, they would create these funky web pages. And there was much less of a line between creating and consuming. So the internet felt a lot more expressive and less centralized, right?
I
But
agree.
then I think as you got like 5 billion people on, because the technology couldn't really enable everyone to have that expressive power, we kind of ended up on these centralized like platforms. And I'm not, I worked on a bunch of them, so I'm not kind of complaining, but I think it was more I don't think that's where human nature is. Like human nature is not by default essentially static or, kind of constrained. It's just that the technology didn't exist to allow everyone to express themselves in a way that the digital kind of essentially, infrastructure or products could enable. And I do think that's going to change. I think the internet 5 years from now is going to be super wacky. I think it's going to be super interesting. That's my hope, at least.
Yes. I love this actually point of view that the internet was so interesting in the beginning because everyone was a creator because it was so
Yeah.
easy to like put text on the internet and like link
Yeah.
to some other website.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting insight. And I think something I think about the kind of like current narrative of AI or current narrative of AGI is that the AGI narrative is very much in this like disempowering, centralized, like some central company will build an agent for you and it will know what to do. And then like you ask it, kind of like Siri. Uh, and that feels like, there's like an opposite version of that where we treat, to your earlier question about like, what's the difference between humans and AI? What does AI teach us about what it means to be human? There's like a more human oriented, humane frame of what AI is, which is like humans, what differentiates us from animals is that we build tools.
Yeah.
And like AI is a very powerful tool. And
Yeah.
like we could create it that way and treat it that way. But I think our narratives really affect what we build. What do you think? Like, do you think there's like our narratives shape what we build, or like there's kind of a default path that?
No, I'm a huge believer that the stories that we tell ourselves, either about ourselves or about our community or the people around us, the stories we tell ourselves about our beliefs, our stories we tell ourselves about what we can accomplish individually as a society have a huge effect, right?
Right.
So I often tell people around me, I even tell my kids, like the biggest strength that you have is that you can tell yourself your own story about yourself, right? Like you can have a mental model of what you can do, and that ends up kind of essentially being super self like fulfilling, right? Like what you think you can do is what you often end up doing. So I personally think that even though AI might be like AGI might be centralizing, I actually think it's going to allow people to go back to a world where everybody feels a lot more empowered to
Yeah.
create all kinds of like weird, wacky things that, we can all hopefully like partake in. No, I think that the world is going to be much more literally interesting because I think we will unleash the creativity of like billions of people. Whereas today, like probably only tens of millions of people are like kind of creative on the internet, and it's going to be huge. Like the gulf is going to be huge in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I also have this belief, and part of Imbue's kind of core thesis is tools that allow, or like it requires invention to allow regular people to access core
Yeah.
technologies. Like in the
Absolutely.
1960s, people were really excited about the supercomputer. They're like, everyone's going to do time sharing on supercomputers in the future. And that's not like not everyone. That would have been like, maybe tens of millions of people like what we have today being
Yeah. Yeah.
creators
Yeah.
on the computer. And so people invented, it took invention as Xerox PARC of the mouse and the desktop and the GUI and all of these ideas that make things accessible to people.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to switch gears here for a second and maybe rewind you back a little bit to the early parts of your career, which, by the way, which we obviously had Dropbox, which we also kind of, intersected paths. But, prior, tell us a little bit about what convinced you to join Dropbox, which is a very technical company, in a non-technical capacity. Obviously you had been at MIT and Media Lab. So like how did you think about starting, was Dropbox your first job out of school?
First
So
job.
like, yeah, so how did you decide to kind of like mold in some ways your journey, kind of like using the Dropbox crucible, shall we say, you know?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was totally accidental.
Okay. As all great things are. Okay.
As
Amazing.
Yeah, as all great things are, I was working in high frequency trading to pay for
Okay.
college,
Yep.
and a friend from middle school, Albert Nee, who's the third engineer at Dropbox.
Albie,
Who's
okay.
Albert's 2 years older, and he shows up on campus and he's like, "Let's have lunch." And I was like, "Great." And I hope he's okay with me telling this story, but he was like, "Kanjun, who around you do you want to be in 5 years in trading?" And I was like, I don't know if I want to be these people. Like, this is not really my people. And he
Uh-huh.
was like, "Yeah, I think you're wasting your life. You should apply to Dropbox."
That sounds like a very Albert thing to say. I can totally see it.
I know. So I applied to Dropbox, and I think I was very interested in how businesses were built, but on the people side of things, like how do you get people to do things? But also didn't want to waste my engineering skills, and so I think Dropbox had one of the first technical BizOps teams.
That's true. Yep.
Yeah, and so but BizOps was a good fit.
Got it. You were the first chief of staff actually at Dropbox, and you played a critical role in helping the executive team and the staff, essentially, as we call them, essentially like become a high functioning team, to your point, realize their potential. So tell us a little bit about those early days and kind of what you learned from it, and that you might be that you think is relevant to your work today, maybe.
Yeah, a lot. I think Dropbox was like an MBA basically, but
Okay.
better. um, on BizOps, what happened was I was doing a lot of projects, technical projects, but realizing the people problems are very interesting. And I told Tony Huey, who was one of the co-leads of the BizOps team at the time, I was like, "Hey, I would like to work on more messy people problems." And he was like, "No person I have ever talked to has told me that they want to work on more messy people problems." But like a few months later, he comes back and he's like, "I'm going to go to Japan to run the Japan office. Can you run company planning? It's a messy people problem."
Yep.
I was like, "Sure." And so he helped me put together the initial deck for the plan for company planning and kind of like took it from there. And I think in retrospect, probably if I'd been more experienced, I would have been more effective as chief of staff. We were growing 200 to 1,500 people, something like that.
In
And
the course of like maybe 18 months or something, or maybe 2 years.
exactly in two
Yeah.
years. Yeah. Yeah. And I really learned a lot about, okay, organizationally, we did manage to scale certain things like hiring, but other things like product development, I think it was harder to scale and had to change a lot of processes. And that was a good learning.
Mhm. By the way, everyone on the podcast, Kanjun and I worked very closely together during her time as chief of staff. It
That's right.
was
Aditya was in all the meetings.
I was in all the meetings. Yeah, no, it was kind of a crucible time for Dropbox. I think that sometimes you only understand how critical a particular time period was for a company in retrospect, right? Like when
Yeah.
you're kind of thick in it, it's kind of hard to have perspective at a startup. But looking back, I think those were the 2 years that we really managed to, in some ways, grow into kind of like our user base, our product, our business model, and eventually kind of set us up for going public. At the time, I think it felt like a very hard thing. But I think
Just,
looking back, I'm just really proud of all of the work that we did to kind of like, enable the company that it is today.
yeah, I agree. Like
But yeah,
key things like Dropbox for Business became a thing.
absolutely. It's like,
Yeah,
only 1 billion in ARR today or something.
I know.
Yeah, amazing. But okay, so you were at Dropbox maybe for 3 or 4 years, if I remember correctly, and then you decided that hey, it's time to explore new things. So talk me through a little bit about how you chose to structure your own -1 to 0 journey. I mean, I mentioned that you joined SPC as one of its early members. But I'm curious, like, how did you approach like that meta, almost like idea maze navigation? Like, how did you kind of think about what do I do next? How did you not get burdened it's because it can often feel like, like it's almost like, it can be crushing the number of things you can do. So how did you kind of like navigate that in a lightweight, creative way?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely, those early days were really felt like in retrospect, a really stressful time, but didn't feel that stressful at the time. Um, I think I knew at that time, I had an instinct that like I've always been very interested in this idea that computing, there's a lot more to computing than what we're
Yeah.
getting out of it. And so the first stab at that was VR. Was this feeling in 2015 like, okay, perhaps if computing could be more spatial, this is a new way of interacting with computers. Um, and so we were working on a headset that was lightweight that could be worn for professional use. And we realized the technology is not there for VR, but it is there for high resolution LiDAR, very similar
Yep.
technology. And for me, I was not that interested in high resolution LiDAR, but our co founder, Austin Russell, actually took it and ran with it. And that became Luminar,
Yeah.
which is now a public LiDAR company. And
Amazing. Oh,
I know
I totally had forgotten that it was Austin. Wow,
it
amazing.
was
Okay.
Austin. I know
Yeah,
the
yeah.
world is so small.
It really
Um,
is. I
yeah,
totally
and
had
he was like
forgotten. Okay.
18.
You did, I know. Oh man. Okay,
He
so
was
he
really
went off and
wonderful.
did that.
Yeah.
And then you and Josh then essentially kind of did you take that and make it sorceress? Is that kind of the sequencing?
Well, so me and Josh, we had a couple of other co-founders we were iterating on a bunch of
Okay.
ideas with, and like we lots of different ideas. We kind of had many ways of brainstorming problems and thinking about what are problems in our current life. And eventually, it was really me and Josh who were like, okay, we really think there's something in AI in the future. Um, we were really interested in like, can we get computers to do things on our behalf? And if so, like, where's the potential there? Like, what can that potentially unlock? And at that time, we had a sense of the capabilities, which were not that good. There's like uh, ImageNet was like starting to show some fruit.
Yep. Yep.
I think Andre had published this like RNN piece,
Yep. I remember that.
and yeah, and so we were like, okay, looking into the future, it feels like um, when it comes to systems that can take action, like where that can unlock potential, like maybe there's something in human processes, like recruiting is a process we were both very familiar with. And in
Yep.
recruiting, it felt like there's both a lot of repetitive work for recruiters and also people hate the job search process. You just have this like terrible experience.
Yeah.
And so we knew kind of at that time, like we can only apply AI to a very vertical slice. And so we need to pick a vertical slice. And I forget what else we explored. We explored a bunch of vertical slices and we landed on recruiting.
And in the early days, so this was in 2017, is that right?
This
2018?
was in 2016.
2016. Okay. And so this is before, I mean, hey, nobody was talking about so people are talking about deep learning, but this was way before any LLM, even like before GPT-1 or 2. I'm very curious, like I think our audience would love to hear a little bit more about how does one develop convicted future points of view, because that's not
Hmm.
an easy thing to do.
When I think back to that time, it really does feel like um, CNES, like
Yep.
let us go beyond the edge. So we had this co-living house, the archive,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually out of the archive, the co-authors of GPT-3, Tom Brown and Ben Mann, were in our house, and
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of people who were at OpenAI very early on.
Yep.
It was a house of a lot of AI researchers who were at Google Brain at the time,
Oh, yeah.
mostly,
Mm-hmm.
and then like eventually left Brain to go to OpenAI and do these other things. And I think we had a sense like there's something going on here, and it feels like there's like it's still very early, it's still research, but there's something here that is the future. Like in our generation, the dream we talked about AGI at that time,
Mm-hmm.
the dream of computers that could generally do things for us could potentially be realized. I think a lot of people at that time didn't believe that at all.
Right.
Like if you asked most people, they'd be like, "That's totally crazy. There's no way." Computers
Right.
are nowhere near human capability. And I think some of the early things you're seeing about neural nets, like, really did feel like there was something there.
Right.
I think ultimately Sorceress was too early for that technology, but uh, yeah, but I
I
think we
think
did
it's
see that.
I would say again, kind of like busting mythologies, right? Like I think people often assume that iconoclastic founders are kind of, contrarian by themselves, right? And I think that what actually happens in practice is that you're surrounded by a bunch of people who can, in some ways, give each other like confidence and inspiration, right? That like, hey, this worldview that is contrarian like I don't have to be the only crazy one, right? It kind of helps to just have like 5 other people who you respect who have the same viewpoint. And this is what I tell people about coming and joining SPC. The real value of a place like SPC, or even the other places that you mentioned, is that it allows you to kind of like not feel alone sometimes in your craziness, and it
Yes.
allows you to explore like 2 or 3 degrees of disbelief in a way that doesn't, like it gives you that space to actually be able to do that in like in a way that I think is very hard to do, either sitting by yourself, right, like in isolation, or frankly even within a company, right? And the other thing I tell people is that I personally think that it's actually important to do some of this before you have nailed down an exact like company idea that you're trying to scale, right? Like it's actually important to like develop some of these points of view in almost like a blue sky way before you have in some ways the pressure of kind of like creating a product, scaling a product, and so on.
Yeah, I think like
Yeah.
iconic companies that really are enduring and do something very different, like there's kind of a going beyond that. There's like, this sphere or circle of known things by most people, and you really have to go beyond the edge quite far. And
Correct.
so I agree. Like, yeah, it's hard to do that by yourself. You have to do
Yep.
it in a either in like kind of like a thought sphere,
Yep.
which Twitter allows for a lot these
Yeah, that's
days,
true actually. Yeah.
or like a live community like SPC or the
Yeah.
archive.
Yeah, my hope actually is that, as we certainly expand SPC to like different locations around the world, like, we have SPC SF New York, we're doing Bangalore next month.
Oh, that's cool.
um yeah, it's cool. My hope is that like actually like it allows like, a lot more entrepreneurs around the world to be able to like find this stroke of inspiration by simply providing the setting. And frankly, I hope there are like more communities like SPC that spring up, because I think that this is the biggest limiting factor to actually like allow like a generation of like, sorry, an order of magnitude more founders to exist in the world, is to actually like give them this collective like confidence that like some of the zany ideas that you're like exploring are actually okay. Like it's fine to go and give it a shot for 2 or 3 years. It will not sound so zany, like, once like essentially you're surrounded by people who can help you like develop that confidence. We were talking to Tyler Cohen last week, and he mentioned something that was really interesting. He basically said that he kind of asks people when they apply for a grant from emergent ventures. He actually just asks them like, how talented is your group of friends, right? And then he asks them in a very direct way, like, what are you doing to, in some ways, make sure that you are surrounded by really talented people, right? Like, in some ways, when I look at your kind of, I would say, network of collaborators across your different projects, whether it's Jason Ben, Michael Nielsen, to Josh Albrecht, obviously to Ali Road, you have a core group of collaborators, it seems like, that you have collaborated with on different projects. How have you cultivated those relationships? Like, how have you kind of like really, it sounds like you've been quite intentional and quite, I would say, intentional about it. So, how have you thought about that?
Yeah. So we started this big 20-person co-living house in 2015, the archive,
Okay.
and the intention behind it was basically this idea. There are two ideas. One is you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time
Yep.
with.
Yep.
And then two is in the military, they did a study on how to form really deep relationships. And it turns out there are three things. The first is shared experiences. The second is spontaneous interactions. Actually, not everything is scheduled. And the third is a space where you feel like you can let your guard down. So psychological safety. And it's no surprise that most people form their best relationships in college because college has all three of these things. But actually, when people go into adult life, like most of these, at least one of these three things disappears. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, this makes sense. And it's very hard to do this as adults, actually.
It's very hard. Yeah. Road trips are good places to do this, but kind of like an ongoing space for that. We
Yeah.
actually built the archive very intentionally. What I wanted was like a place that helped people build their sense of agency.
Yep.
And I think Michael Nielsen actually described it as kind of like a machine for creating agency, like some plunk someone in and out they come and they're like much more agentic.
Well,
And
yeah, yeah.
so, yeah, very interested in like agency, what causes it, why, why do some people have such a deep sense of agency? And I think most of most of my collaborators came out of the network of the archive, and really from realizing that I and the other person have some deep shared value or shared sense of some sense of potential.
I'm going to come back to this because I think this is actually a thread I want to pull on, kind of like the agentic behavior, particularly as it comes to your work today. Before I get into that, one thing I'll say that coming back to that 3-point rubric for how to kind of cultivate, I would say, cultivate close relationships. I actually think this is why sports is such a popular mechanism. So it's such a popular, I would say, activity amongst adults. It's because I actually think it allows for all three things, which is that it's a shared experience of kind of like, kind of going through like some kind of like competition that you're watching together. I think it allows for spontaneous, essentially, interactions because you're often spending quite a bit of time doing it. And I think it is, I think this is why like it's actually forms the basis of a lot of like deep adult friendships. So like a lot of people who watch sports actually like exhibit this closeness to like the group that they do it with. And I think there's not enough of that in kind of like the adult world. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. That's super interesting. Yeah, spontaneous and this amount of unstructured time together. Sports allow
Yeah,
for that.
exactly. But let me come back to agency. I'm curious if you think that, I mean, I'm just working through this in my own head. Do you think that AI agents will have human-like agency? And it's a little bit interesting because we call them agents, which now that you think about the provenance of the term, probably means that you want them to have agency. But it's a different kind of agency, I guess, which is you want them to do things broadly, but ultimately still under the umbrella of what a human wants them to do, I guess. But I'm curious, how do you think about agency in the context of like AI agents that, Imbue is working on?
Yeah, it's a really deep question. So AI agents, they have goals, and they can kind of, figure out better versions of those goals, iterate toward better versions of those goals, try to figure out how to accomplish those goals. Hopefully, the goal is given to them by a human. They're not just going rogue,
Yep.
and there's human oversight. Humans, we don't always have goals. We're not always goal directed, and we are often playing. And I haven't quite figured out what play is. It's some people they think, or some philosophers or researchers they think play is kind of an exploration behavior. So AIs can also have this exploration behavior, see what works. Maybe that's true, but it feels like it's more than just raw exploration. It feels like there's something interesting going on in play that's also about following a sense of taste or beauty, or kind of expressing creativity or expressing some drive or some need. And I think human agency is rooted in actually maybe more in play and more in expression than it is rooted in goal directedness. I think goal directedness is like a pretty recent industrial era belief system. And for most of human history, a lot of what we've done is driven by play.
Yeah.
And there's something really interesting about play, which is that I think another thing that humans do is kind of like transform our beliefs and stories about the world, about what's important, about what's true, about our morality, and that totally changes what goals we want to have as a society, as individuals, etc. And so this kind of like transformational power of that totally changes what a person believes is important. I think AIs can do this, but that it's certainly not the natural way of things. And I actually think this is where what makes humans human, what makes AI. Like the way in which we are compatible as humans and AI tools is like the AI helps us accomplish goals, but we have the taste. We are the tastemakers.
Yeah, I could not agree more with everything you've said. I mean, I think that there is an element of being human that is in some ways, I don't even know if I have the right words to express it. I think play is actually a good word, but it's actually in some ways like undirected almost interactions in the world that are satisfying some reward function that might not be pre-specified, and in some ways like are a little randomized, right? It's kind of
Yeah,
like I
and it
I
might
go
not
out,
be. Yeah,
it
go
might
ahead.
not be goal driven, and it's almost like I don't even know if I'm seeking it out, but I kind of like it when I have it. And I
Yeah,
think
there might not be a reward function. I'm not even sure. Like, is there any
exactly.
reward?
And I think that what's interesting is that you're absolutely correct that, in my opinion, sorry, not absolutely. I suspect that even in those kind of behaviors, there is unsupervised learning going on, which is that you're kind of learning about the world and updating your models. But that is a very different, almost like modality and framing than I think the core loops that we train these models on, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't actually know how to specify the reward function of just like living and kind of playing. I don't actually know, like you can maybe do it for these agents, but I think that you're right that the agents today are very much like, how do you enable humans to in some ways extend their agency, right? Like
Exactly.
how do you become a vehicle for a human to have more agency? So it's an agency via a human, not kind of like almost as a first order bit, in my opinion, so far.
Exactly.
And I think that's actually like, for me, whenever anybody talks about the Duma scenario, I'm just like, actually, I don't actually think we know how to build these agents that have like any agency beyond what a human wants to do, right? And now, like, yes, will it enable humans to do more bad things? Probably, absolutely, right? There's no question. But every tool allows humans to do like more bad things at scale, and we have to figure out how to prevent that.
Yeah.
Um,
That is like core. That's what technology is
by definition, it's like a
by
definitional
definition.
thing. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think your
Yeah,
point is good. Actually, when we first started Imbue, which was generally intelligent at that time, we were interested in general agents, and exploration and play was part of the thinking. Like, okay, maybe you want agents that explore and play. And I think over time for me, I realized like, actually, I don't think that's what you want. Like, I don't think that's good necessarily as a technology to build. And it's actually better to build systems that help humans accomplish goals and allow humans to do the things we enjoy around play.
yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think that I always tell people that part of the most interesting aspect of me learning about AI is to actually have three young children at home, right? Like I
Interesting. What do
was,
you feel like?
yeah. I mean, like if you kind of see how they learn about the world, it is
One.
actually just through like play and exploration. And some of it is goal driven, but their goals are like very simple slash maybe even non-existent. It is literally they wake up and they're like, I'm going to go interact with the world. I might not even have like goals beyond like the obviously satisfying my basic kind of like needs, like from a biological and physiological perspective. But in the act of interacting with the world in this undirected way, they are basically clearly updating their models in interesting ways.
By the
Yeah.
way, I think we could actually build agents, even in the current training paradigm, that play more and kind of do this
Okay.
undirected exploration, but that we would find it annoying. Like it
Mm-hmm.
would, they would do all sorts of crazy things, and we'd be like, "This
Yeah.
is super annoying. Like, stop."
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not even clear that we would be comfortable with them exploring that, right? At least,
Exactly.
yeah, I agree. Um, okay, to maybe kind of like bring it home, and I obviously it sounds like you guys are working on Imbue and you plan on doing that for a long time to come. I think that this is maybe the defining, not the defining, it's like there's so much to build, right, in terms of like the substrate that we have with these models, but what we need to build for the next 10 20 years. But I'm curious, like how do you think about the next 10 years of your career, right? Like how do you I mean, there's no shortage of things to interest us right now, but how do you keep yourself fresh, challenged? How do you make sure that you're tackling things that are going to occupy you for a while? Any tips that you can give to our listeners?
Hmm. Oh man. Yeah. I think I actually for a long time pursued goals that were not truly mine. They were not truly intrinsically motivated. I was still like, we talked about therapy earlier. I was still like enacting some of the beliefs of my
Yeah,
parents, like try
absolutely.
to be successful. And it's taken me a long time. I think Imbue in this iteration is finally the core of what I care about deeply. Um, I say like our mission is kind of to radically increase what computing can do for people, and to try to make that really accessible to everyone and enable people, as you said, to all be creators on our computers. And that feels deeply resonant in a way that the things I've done before, they were more instrumental, and this is
Yeah.
not so instrumental. And I've noticed like I see Imbue as a much more enduring company. I think right now Imbue has this incredible window of opportunity where agents don't quite work yet, but they really do feel
Yeah.
like they're on the cusp. And so, how do we get to something that is starting to work and is able to kind of cannibalize all the capabilities into it that are coming out? And then I also think of, okay, this is not the only of window opportunity that we'll ever have. There will be more windows that open up every 5, 10 years. And so kind of thinking toward the long-term mission of like, there's always more to unlock in computing for a long time, I think. And I guess I don't think about my own career very much. Like I think I have a lot of trouble working on things that don't deeply motivate me. And so it's hard for me. I think I told someone like, I'm not a very good employee anymore. I don't think I can do it.
Hopefully AI actually makes a lot of us to be worse employees and maybe like better people with agency who want to
Yeah,
think like yeah. And I think this will actually be a good thing for the world.
I strongly agree. Actually, one of the things I'm really interested in is kind of individual or small group entrepreneurship. So,
Absolutely.
like, how many individual, Imbue, a lot of what we do is allowing agents and people to write software because agents, to have a true good action space, they have to be able to write code. And so, I think like there's going to be this whole economy of software creators who are not software engineers today. And they can be like individual entrepreneurs, a whole creator economy for software once software is super cheap to build.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine like how, I mean, it'd be amazing if if like somebody built a software, if a lot more people could build software products that even 1,000 people wanted to use, that would be incredibly empowering for like a lot, and it would create so much useful software. Because today's
Totally.
software, again, is so centralized. Like all the SaaS, all of these things, like we end up getting these monolithic companies that then add like 100 knobs to make it work for me. But what if I just want something that's built for me? Right.
Yeah.
And like this could actually enable that, like, having a lot more people who can write software.
Totally. I think when people think about agents, they often have this mental model where they think, oh, an agent, it's a personal assistant. But the reality is, if you're talking to your agent and your agent's talking to your computer by writing software or invoking calls, then what you're doing is an agent is a layer of abstraction on top of your computer. And so an agent, in some ways, like the general version of it, is a programming language. And
Yeah.
so, what that's doing is like making software basically universally accessible. And to your point of, a person with their like 1,000 true fans, like people on Substack today can make a living with 1,000 people paying for their writing. In the
Yeah.
future, certainly like in many fields of research and science, there are like tons of niche tools that people would pay at least a little bit for, and like tons of people could make, have their 1,000 true fans making software.
100%. I mean, I look forward to that world. Well, Kanjun, thank you so much for the time today. I think that your journey obviously has been inspirational for me to watch from kind of like, close quarters for a number of the hops in your journey. But I suspect that, this is just the beginning in terms of like, what you will do in our kind of like ecosystem in our industry. So thank you again for taking the time to be on. We all learned a bunch. And I look forward to seeing kind of, what you do next, both at Imbue and, kind of like beyond that.
Thanks, Aditya. This was super fun.
Awesome. All right. Take care. Thank you.